you, Prime Minister. Can you update us on progress to get British hostages home from the terrorist group Hamas who currently holds them?
Yes, I mean, I think hopefully everyone will understand there's a limit to what I can say publicly about this, but what I can say is we are working day and night to secure their safe release. Now, that involves lots of conversations with lots of different people. We are doing that, and this is part of why we've had discussions in the past with different people's views on ceasefires and pauses. For us, those have to involve the release of hostages. And it's clear that the last one that we had of these was broken because Hamas stopped releasing hostages, including specifically women. I don't think that was right. When I last spoke to the Emir of Qatar, I commended them for their efforts, and we're in dialogue with them in particular about trying to restart that process and to secure the safe release of all hostages, but obviously British hostages.
On the point of a ceasefire, your foreign secretary has used the phrase, and you have, a sustainable ceasefire. What are the conditions or criteria that need to be met for a sustainable ceasefire to be able to come into place?
Yes, I think, look, it's important for us to ceasefire to be sustainable, it's absolutely right to ask what are those conditions so that it doesn't collapse. Look, there isn't a perfect formula for peace, right? But what I can say is that a ceasefire is clearly not going to last if hostages are still being held, and that was your first question. And also if Hamas, whose stated aim is to destroy Israel, is still able to operate in underground tunnels and launch rocket attacks into Israel. So I think those are important facets that we need to grapple with. And ahead of a permanent ceasefire, what we'd like to see are immediate and sustained humanitarian pauses which allow release of more hostages and more aid to enter Gaza. And in particular, to go to the previous question about leadership, I think we were the first country to say to the Israelis they had to open Kerem Shalom crossing so we could get more aid in. That's something that I spoke to Prime Minister Netanyahu about myself, and I'm pleased that that is now happening, not in the quantities that we all want, but it is an improvement. Again, that is the UK showing leadership on this issue and making a real difference to people.
And I think we're all very grateful to see that additional aid route opened. But when you last appeared before this committee, I warned you that I feared we were facing the Gaza crisis of 2023. Now, I didn't expect it to come in the form that it has. In response to my question, you called for Israel to adhere to the principles of necessity and proportionality, and you also said at the time that you urged Israel to show restraint. Can you give an example of where the UK has achieved restraint in the IDF's response to the horrific atrocities that took place on the 7th of October?
I mean, from the beginning of this, from my first visit to Israel, we have made repeated calls for Israel to adhere to international humanitarian law, to take every practical...
Where have we achieved restraint or a change in their behaviours? Because that's the goal of raising it with them, is to achieve national defence.
I mean, I'm obviously not the one making operational decisions on the ground, but we have consistently urged Israel where they can to avoid harming innocent civilians. Far too many have died, and that is about providing notice, providing safe areas, safe passage during the early phases of the conflict, but also about making sure that aid reaches those people who need it. I said early on, we focused on getting Rafah opened, which happened. Yeah. We also focused on making sure fuel was able to come in because that was necessary. But also, most recently, as I said, on Kerem Shalom, again, that has happened. So these are all proof points that the approach we're taking is yielding
on
outcomes.
The humanitarian side, it certainly is.
But those are all things that are making a real difference to people.
Yes, but they're not necessarily preventing bombings, targeting. So, for example, Biden has said that there were indiscriminate bombings taking place. Do you agree?
As I've been very clear, too many innocent civilians have died, and
so
we've
therefore
been very...
you agree that the targeting is indiscriminate. Therefore, if civilians have died,
I'm not privy to the precise targeting, but what I can say is clear that too many innocent people have died in this conflict.
But you will have received advice from government lawyers and submissions. Have any of those submissions or any advice you've received from lawyers or anyone within Number 10 suggested that international humanitarian law is being broken?
No, again, the government never comments on the legal advice it receives. Now, that what is absolutely clear, I've been consistent throughout this from day one. We can't forget what happened. Right? Hamas perpetrated an appalling terror attack on Israel. Innocent people were slaughtered, and Israel has every right to defend itself, to ensure its security, make sure that nothing like that ever happens again to its citizens. we would do exactly the same.
But there
if
are
it was
also
us.
limits under international law.
And of course
to
there
the
are,
right
and
of
I've made that
self-defence.
point from the beginning, and we've consistently called on Israel to do that.
So
and
forgive
that
me,
will,
though,
what we will always do.
But forgive me, Prime
and
Minister,
alongside that,
your current Foreign Secretary, when he was Prime Minister, was quite happy to state when he felt that international humanitarian law was being broken in Syria. Equally, James Cleverly's Foreign Secretary was happy to say that war crimes are taking place in Ukraine. So surely there is a precedent that you are able to say, if you believe that too many civilians are dying, that bombings have been indiscriminate, and therefore that the principles of necessity and proportionality are not being upheld.
you're putting words in my mouth. Others may have said that.
Your exact words were too many civilians are dying. You've just repeated it here as well.
Yes, and now too many civilians are dying. Of course, too many civilians are dying. That is different from saying humanitarian law has been broken.
So
every civilian, quite
where is the
frankly,
responsibility for too many civilians dying?
every civilian dying is a tragedy.
But where does the
civilian dying
responsibility
is a
sit for that
tragedy.
decision making?
Sorry?
Where does the responsibility sit for too many civilians dying?
Again, ask Hamas why they embed themselves
No,
in
but
civilian
forgive me, Prime
populations.
Minister, but when we
I think that's genuinely an extraordinary question. Responsibility for civilians dying. There's two sides to this. Israel is trying to defend itself. If the terrorist organisation which is perpetrating these attacks is deliberately embedding itself inside civilian populations, then they have to accept responsibility for that.
But Prime Minister,
I think Israel is rightly should take every precaution to avoid harming civilians. But that will be very difficult if the precise organisation which has caused untold suffering to the Israeli people is hiding amongst civilians, knowingly doing so, knowingly putting them in harm's way. And it's important not to forget that that is what is going on here.
Very brief final question.
Yes, Prime Minister, nobody's forgotten the crimes against humanity that took place in Israel. There's no more equivalence between the two of them. However, whether it was Northern Ireland, where the UK police had to show restraint and ensure that civilians were not, loss of life was not out of line, disproportionate with the military objectives. When fighting Daesh as well, Daesh did the exact same tactics as Hamas, and yet we did not see this level of casualty. So therefore, will you do more to achieve actual restraint in some of the actions that are taking place on the ground?
We have repeatedly and will repeatedly call on Israel to show restraint, to operate within international humanitarian law, to take every possible precaution to avoid harming civilians, and crucially to allow far more aid to get into Gaza to actually help people. And that is what we are doing, and it is showing that it is working. As I said, the opening of Kerem Shalom is meaningful. We're also exploring alternative maritime corridors, which we've been clear, given our assets in Cyprus, we can play a leading role in. So we are working every which way to get more aid to the people who need it. We've already tripled our aid into the region, and we continue to have dialogue with all our partners about the future of Gaza post this conflict, and that involves my conversations with the Palestinian Authority and others to make sure that we can provide a future for the Palestinian people where they can live with dignity, prosperity and security. That is something that we are completely committed to and will continue to work very hard to bring about.
Thank you, Chair.